Right, we are good to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor.
Sorry, are we recording as well?
Okay,
Thanks.
no problem.
Once we got YouTube, we are fine.
Okay. Thank you and good evening and a pleasant Sabbath to everyone who is once again joining us. And for those of you who couldn't make it last week, but you're here, we are grateful to God for having seen us through yet another week. As Pastor said, a lot of us probably usually look forward to Friday evening when the sun sets, and at least we can switch off for that 24 hours, just reflecting and engaging and entering into this amazing period of rest that God has given us. I don't know what usually your week is like, but I truly appreciate the blessings of and the rest that the Sabbath truly gives us. So last week we started with the introduction, looking at our mental health, as in general, touching on a few general basis about mental health. Today we are moving kind of more specifically into some of the common mental health disorders. So we're looking at depression and suicide prevention today. God willing, next Friday, we'll be looking at anxiety disorders and possibly, if time allows, maybe touch on trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder in particular as well. And then we see where we go from there. So as a way of starting, Pastor, am I able to share my slides?
Yes, you have.
Okay, let me try that. Right, it says host disabled, participant screen sharing.
I gave you access. Oh, sorry, I gave to a different Emmanuel. Sorry. Right. So you have it now.
Thank you very much.
I had it by accident.
Okay. All right. So let's try it. All right. Can people see that now, or let me? I need to do that. Ah, right. Okay. So
Not yet. Yeah.
Okay. So slideshow. That's it. Well, thank you very much. So this is what we're looking at today. Again, your mental health and you, depression and suicide prevention. Let me start with the introduction of a statement that C.S. Lewis, some of us would have, well, he's been quite a popular figure. And something he wrote when it comes to mental and emotional pain, this is what he says: mental pain is less dramatic than physical pain, but it is more common and also more hard to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain increases the burden. It is easier to say, my tooth is aching, than to say, my heart is broken. And I think as a society, this kind of captures, or for a long time at least, this has captured how we have dealt with issues around mental health, and more so in particular in the church, where everything is go and I'll pray for you. And it's almost like then everything is okay. And for that reason, for a long time, many of us will struggle, maybe even now, there are some of us that will still struggle to, for example, say, today it's not a good day, or that I'm really going through some terrible time right now. And we would usually put up the amazing Sabbath smile I referred to last week, and go away, because of things like stigma over the years. We all struggle to be open about our mental and emotional pain, but rather easily people be able to talk about the physical pain that they struggle. But when it comes to mental pain, it has been a problem for many. In 2000 I think 18, the World Health Organization, again looking at the subject of mental health and in particular depression, they came up with a theme, and the theme was mental health or depression, let's talk. The reason for this is that research, and this is around the world, the problem of stigma is actually is one that not just those of us here living in the UK or those of us maybe living in some other parts of the world struggle with. It's a worldwide problem where, because of stigma, because of people's perceptions of mental health, there were many, and probably still many, that are struggling, but will struggle in silence because of fear of how people will perceive them. So they created the theme of mental health, let's talk, just to encourage the conversation, so that if someone is struggling, they don't feel they have to struggle in silence. Especially now that a lot of countries are at least making the effort to invest a little bit more in our mental health. But just as a basic information in terms of figures that they came up with, what they discovered was that around the world at the time, and I would assume if I could get today's figures as of 2021 or 2022, we probably will find that this figure maybe is kind of gone up that bit more, because you've got more and more people coming forward seeking for support, which means that we're able to see those figures increasing. But in 2015 or 2018, thereabouts, when this sort of depression, let's talk theme came up from the World Health Organization, their stats were suggesting that about 300 million people around the world would live with depression in any given year. And I think in local different national countries, what we have, when we break this down, is that 1 in 4 normally would have a mental health disorder in any given year. Something, again, I mentioned last time. So usually, people have all sorts of thoughts, views about what, we think depression is, or the knowledge we tend to have. But let me say, there are some myths. There are some things, some views that we hold about depression, which may not necessarily be accurate. So just kind of to highlight a few of this as we go along. Some people would, believe that all depressions are the same. It's one and the same. There are no difference. But that, as I said, the heading is a myth. It's not necessarily true. There are various types of depression that people would experience. Sometimes one of the most difficulties that people have is when they struggle and somebody will say, "Oh, come on, pull yourself together." Because depression is nothing just more than a faulty thinking. I would like to hope that sometimes that was the case, but in reality, we know that isn't necessarily the case. Depression sometimes is a lot more than just faulty thinking, and we will discover more as we go through this presentation. Some people hold the view that going on antidepressants would cure, again, the depression, and again, that is a myth. Antidepressants would help, and for some people is actually needed to be able to function, but it doesn't necessarily cure usually what the root causes of that might be. And then some people also would say, "Oh, well, people who commit suicide are always depressed." Of course, depression has a reasonable high rate of suicide sort of ideation attached to it. But it isn't the case that people who commit suicide is always as a result of depression. In fact, even those who do commit suicide because they have experienced depression, sometimes what we do know is that they don't tend to commit suicide when they are in the deep sense of, low mood and no energy, and the depression is extremely terrible. Sometimes what we actually discover is that these people would do so when they seem to have come out of the depression somewhat, and they seem to be in control in what they're doing. And sometimes that is the riskier or the more dangerous part that we need to be aware of. Depression would only occur if you give into it. Again, it's not as simple and as straightforward as whether you give in or not give in. So what is it? I mean, how would we define depression? It's a word that I'm sure over this last few years, many of us might have heard about it. Maybe a friend struggled with it. Maybe somebody we know has gone through with it. But what is it? A simple definition that I've taken and we can reflect on here is that it is a common mental health disorder, is an illness, something that presents with depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure, feelings of guilt or low self-worth, intense feelings of negativity, hopelessness, and helplessness. I'll talk a bit more about the other symptoms as well, but usually you would find that regardless of the type that somebody might be going through, in terms of the type of depression they might be struggling, some of these key symptoms are almost always present. So things like depressed mood. So this is where you may find someone that perhaps used to be Mr. or Mrs. Jolly Go happy type person, a young person that may be always vibrant here, there, and everywhere. But then depression hits, and all of a sudden, this same person, you find the mood is significantly dropped. So the same person that used to find pleasure in doing things, had interest, and always on the bubbly side, even not if not on the bubbly side, the mood is usually quite stable. They will get on with things, get on with life. You see such a sharp contrast in terms of moods and in terms of how they function. They will tend to lose interest in the things that they used to enjoy in the past. And even when they're able to drag themselves to do things, usually it's almost like just going through the motions. There isn't any pleasure, any joy in what they actually do. And then you would find that for some people, they go through a phase where they are usually feeling guilty for almost everything, even when they haven't actually done or committed any offense or any crime. They still feel guilty for it. They would assume blame even for things that they are not responsible for. And one of the other areas also is that you find their self-worth is impacted quite significantly. And then we talk about negativity. So usually you would find these people go through a phase where people will use the expression, they always see the glass half empty instead of half full. So they tend to be on the pessimist side rather than being optimist. And you also find that there is a significant element of hopelessness and also helplessness. Everything is way too much of a task. Energy is simply not there, and the future just looks bleak. They just can't see past where they are. So you would find, as a way of defining, usually these tend to be present in almost all the types of depression that one may experience. Again, just sort of reminding you of what we did last time. I will break somewhere for maybe 5 minutes, and again, invite comments, invite questions, so we make it a bit more interactive as we go along. Now, depression, part of it is also sometimes caused as a result of a reduction in the brain chemical called serotonin. Serotonin is usually responsible for stabilizing our moods and also responsible for keeping important aspects of our lives, such as sleep, sexual desire or function, our appetite, our memory, and some of our social behaviors. And when the level of serotonin is reduced, and therefore you don't have the same amount that you need to function, what you would find is that some of these areas begins or gets affected. So with depression, then you would find either the mood drops, or maybe in the way of things like bipolar, people have the extremes. And again, I'll sort of talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So when there is an impact, on the level of serotonin, all these areas can be impacted in the life of anyone. And what you would find is that, for example, when you go to your GP for medication, essentially what they're giving you is to help to improve the levels of serotonin, so you get what you need to be able to get your functioning. Let me just say here that I know sometimes some of us are very reluctant when it comes to the idea of medication to help with mental health. Now, in the ideal world, I don't think there is any clinician out there that usually would advocate for long-term usage of medication. However, in the short term, sometimes this is very important for someone just to be able to get their functioning up and running, so they can get around to doing even some of the basic things that they need to do. Okay, let me cover precipitating factors, and then I'll take a little break for any questions, any comments, or anything like that. So how, in terms of the cause of depression, experts are telling us that even as at now, we don't actually know the exact cause of why depression occurs. But what we do know is that there are various factors that usually can become risk factors or precipitating factors leading somebody to experience depression. Some of these factors include life stressful events. And of course, I mean, who doesn't deal with some form of stress in this life? I would be surprised if there is anyone out there with zero stress in life. Please let me know, and maybe you can provide a few tips. But we all have to deal with some sort of stress in our lives on a day-to-day basis. But there are certain life stresses that sometimes can be that little bit more than perhaps what we can deal with, and that then can exacerbate the likelihood of somebody getting into depression. So one thing we do know is that loss. When people experience loss and bereavement, it can lead people to struggle with depression. And when we talk about loss, we're not only talking about loss as in through death. There is loss of a spouse. Yes, that can be through death, or that can be through separation. There is loss of a job, loss of a pet, loss of children. So for example, a parent or parents having the hope of what they believe in their kids could become, and yet at some point in time, these children then deciding to go on a separate track. So that sense of loss of the hope that they had can impact the parents. And then there is issues of failure, loss of status. So somebody may feel within their community they might have been a very responsible or respected individual for whatever life perhaps had offered them. And then something happens, life changes, and the status that they had, when that is gone, that in itself can also be a significant precipitating factor for somebody also experiencing depression. And then, of course, when you talk about, if there is a line of people or family members who have struggled with depression in the family, we say that there is a high likelihood or high risk or high predisposition that that individual can also experience depression. Of course, I mentioned this briefly last time. There is also depression that can be experienced as a result of childbirth and hormonal changes, mainly for our mothers and for our amazing women. And then there is social isolation. Last time, I think I kind of roughly highlighted the importance of connecting. There are some people that who live and breathe and live their lives in their little corner, hardly ever engage with anyone. We were not made to isolate. We were made to connect. And so when a person isolates and continuously isolates, that in itself can be a risk factor. But also if the person is already going through depression and they continue with isolation, that can become a maintenance factor that would help to keep the depression going. So when a person is going through depression, one of the things you really want to try and get yourself out of, or if somebody is helping to help the person to get out of, is to break that cycle of isolation and try to reconnect with the world around you or with the people around you. And then there is also substance abuse. There are people that still believe that if I'm going through some challenges, the first thing I'm looking for is let me drown my sorrows in the bottle. I know I'm speaking with Christians here, so I do believe that this may not be applicable, but I know the temptation exists. And sometimes when you're really down in the dumps, you feel like something to take the edge or the pain away could help. So some people turn to substances like alcohol, like drugs, but what we do know is that alcohol, drugs, these things are usually actually depressants. So whilst a person may get a short-term relief from it, in the long term, they only actually perpetuating, they're prolonging the problem rather than dealing with it. And then there are those where, again, medical conditions can be a source or a precipitating factor leading somebody to experience depression. So take, for example, somebody who's had an amazing life, and then all of a sudden at some stage in your life, whether young, old, middle-aged, old, all of a sudden you've been diagnosed with this condition, maybe a terminal problem, maybe a chronic pain, you simply can't seem to shake, or it simply won't go away. For some people, it gets to a point where they would say they're actually totally fed up. It begins to affect your mood. It begins to affect the way you look at life, the way you look at your future, all of which can contribute to a person going through depression. And then there are psychosocial factors such as money problems, prolonged stress, housing issues, families that feel they just can't provide for their families, either due to money or prolonged stress, or sometimes housing issues. You may find that this can contribute to people experiencing depression. In fact, I'm aware of cases where some fathers, feeling that they have failed to be able to provide adequately for their family, have gone as far as not just experiencing depression, but believing that there is no future for them, and have gone on to actually commit suicide as a result of this. So all these different factors, all of which any of us can experience at any given time in our lives, means that in as much as you may be strong and healthy today, it doesn't mean you are completely immune to any of these life's problems, and therefore the possibility that you could also find yourself struggling with the problem of depression. Right, I will take a break here just for 5 minutes, so that if there is something maybe you wanted to comment on, or question you wanted to ask, that you don't forget, towards, if I carry on. So please, 5 minutes, question, comment, an experience you want to share, anything, so that we all can continue with the learning. The floor is opened.
Yeah, it sounds really silly, but I thought, is there any way to get that chemical sanatoni in a vegetable?
In a vegetable? It's not a silly question. It's actually.
I know, it's silly, but I thought that maybe, or a mineral, we can find it in Mother Earth, so we don't have to get the chemical. version.
Okay. Right. I do know there is a natural alternative called St. John's worts. Um, so that is a natural alternative. Some of the other processed chemicals that or medication that you would get from a GP. But let me say that even with the St. John's worts, if you're going to take it, usually have a conversation with your GP in case you are on any other medication, just to be sure that it is compatible
Well,
with what you're taking.
Thank you, brother. And I am not in any form of medication. What about vervain? There's another one we call vervain, Moroccan vervain, which actually I'm taking.
Okay.
And I've been taking for a few weeks now because I mean I think honestly I do tick most of those squares about depression. All the circumstances possible, yes, I'm there in most of them. But I think I was aware of it. And the thing is, the knowledge is the important thing. I wasn't in the knowledge, but when it came to the knowledge, which is, I'm afraid, a little bit before you program, is when I cannot pray on it and took is taking measure. That's why I started taking vervain. But at the same time, I had to be honest with this in this thing. Although when you're going through it, this is my personal view. I'm aware that I'm gonna going through it. It's a state because of consequence of things, and part of me is hard when you go those days low, which they do happen. Most of the time, you enjoy the good days, and the thing is, even though you have a bad days, I have the hope and in my love that God get me through it, and in a way, it's painful at the time, but either way, I just take it as it's going to end. And that is what I think is going to take me through it, as well as the whatever I drink, like vervain, please helping me. But at the end of the day, it's just that, it's not all come back to God. Really, we just have to trust Him. You know, when I feel down, I do feel down. I mean, I think last Saturday I even walked out from church. So it was one of those days where I was really down to the point I walked out from church. But you know, then the good thing I have, the joy of my heart is that it doesn't last. It might last one day. The next day I'm bouncing back again, joyful, praising God all day. So I count my blessings.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
I just have to say, sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm really grateful, you know, that one, to feel able to share something like this. I think that, you know, like I said right from the beginning, it's something that I know when we say one in four, that there are many of us who go through these phases in life, but a lot of the time we would suffer silently and go away. And hopefully this would encourage someone to know that if they are going through as well, it's not just them. But I also just want to highlight the point you made there about, you know, you might be struggling today, but then tomorrow would and could be a different day. And usually that is one of the most important things to be able to find, in that sometimes when people are going through depression, they tend to think that that problem is permanent, that it's never going to go away. But the problem is transient. And that with God's help and with all the other practical support that we can get, that transient problem will pass. And tomorrow could truly be another day. So really thank you for highlighting that point, you know, for us this evening. Anybody else? Maybe one more comment or question, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, hello, Pastor. Can I just confirm? I heard you say his history within the family may act as a predisposing factor, but I just want to check if this will be the case as in genetic disposition.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very good question. There is an element of genetics that is still highlighted, even though in the field of research, I think there is still sort of debate as to be able to pinpoint that particular gene that may be responsible for it. But there is the argument that as a result of the fact that this happens, there's got to be some genes or some genetic factors that may play a role as well. It's just that as far as I'm aware, and with the arguments and research I've read, that they've not been able to pinpoint a particular gene that may be responsible, even though that isn't ruled out.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, can we move on? So moving on to types of depression. As I said in the opening statements about the myths, some people say all depression is the same. It's actually not the case. We do have major depressive disorder, and then which usually would be almost kind of the high level of severity where perhaps a person is actually almost not being able to function. You would find people become unkempt, self-care goes, hardly gets out of bed, as in real struggle to even get going from day to day. And then you would also have dysthymia, which is another type of depression. Usually dysthymia is not as severe, even though it tends to be long-term. So usually somebody would have had this a minimum of 2 years plus to be diagnosed with dysthymia. And then we've also got bipolar. And of course, as the name suggests, we're talking about the opposite ends of the pole. So either the person is super up there, and again, I'll highlight a few symptoms specific to bipolar, or on the other hand, you would find that they are really, really deep down in mood. And then you've got postpartum or depression or postnatal, as we know it, something that usually would occur after a parent or a mother is giving birth to a baby. And then last week, I kind of briefly also mentioned seasonal affective disorder, one that people tend to experience usually during the winter months. But when spring comes around, life, new life, everything changes, everything is amazing. And people then somehow manages to get out of depression. Then, of course, there is situational, which is adjustment disorder. And this is one of the areas where some men, by the way, struggle in terms of when, for example, they may have a baby in the family. It changes the dynamics in the home. And that need to adjust can be a problem for some people. But of course, there are various life events that we all sometimes need to learn to adjust. And that adjustment isn't necessarily always easy for people to make. And then there is also psychotic depression, and psychotic depression usually would have elements of psychosis attached to this depression. So things like hallucination would be experienced whilst the person is going through depression. So these are some of the types of depression that you would come across. In terms of symptoms, again, depending on severity, you may find that some or most of these would exist when somebody is going through depression. To be able to diagnose someone, it's fair to say that just because a person might have a day or two feeling low or feeling down, it does not constitute a person going through depression. Normally, for diagnosis to happen, or for somebody to be diagnosed as having depression, they would have had to live with the symptoms of a minimum of 2 weeks consistently. And then after that, we could be looking at that saying, okay, perhaps this person is now going through depression, as opposed to having the odd sad day or unhappy day because of maybe something they've heard or something someone might have said, or something along those lines. So some of these symptoms include things like significant weight loss or weight gain. For some people, there may be impact on appetite, or that they may have increased appetite. For others, it may be that they turn to food for comfort. So I know that from some of our cultures, traditionally there have been this idea that All of a sudden you see this person gaining weight, that is a sign of good living. Sometimes maybe it might be, but in other cases, it's definitely not a sign of good living. When people are going through depression and they turn to food for comfort, that means they are constantly looking to eat, because that provides them some comfort. It helps to take away the pain. And when that is happening, and of course, with depression, you also find that people reduce activities, usually quite significantly. So you have a combination of somebody who is constantly eating and has become very less active. And that combination can very easily help anyone, to gain weight quite rapidly and quite quickly. And then you would also find that for some people, there are excessive movements, or in some cases, their movements get very slow. And all this is to do with the mental tension of the brain. So you would find that somebody that perhaps was active, usually moving around, doing the stuff that they would do, all of a sudden, life itself feels heavy. Even moving from your living room to your kitchen seems like a real chore. It seems like a real hard task to be able to do. So they become really slow in the way they're moving around. Or for some people, they become super fidgety. They just can't rest. They're constantly on the move, constantly moving around. And sometimes that may be part of the symptoms of depression that they would be going through. And then for others, it's a case of constant fatigue, constantly feeling loss of energy. One of the amazing things, right, about the human body is that sometimes the more we do, the more energetic we become. Have you experienced, a period in your life where perhaps you weren't doing much, and yet you always get up feeling really tired? Because that is simply, our bodies are made to be active, to be able to do things. But when people are depressed and activities are reduced, you would find that sometimes they constantly feeling fatigued because there is no energy whatsoever. And then another thing that you would find is that people become very hopeless, they become very helpless. The hopelessness element is very much a case that people begin to usually judge their futures based on their current life situation. So I'm going through depression right now. Life is horrible. Like, I can't get up, I can't go, I can't work. My home income is affected. My family is struggling. I'm looking at my life right now, and I just can't see how anything is going to change. And then I begin to think, so if my life is what it is now, what is my future going to be like? And when people reach that stage and they begin to judge their futures based on their current, they begin to see their future through the lenses of what life is like today. This is where sometimes people then begin to think, well, if this is what my future is going to be like, then what is the point in going on? And then the whole idea of suicide, the idea of needing to end it because there is no point in carrying on comes. But highlighting the points our sister made when she shared the experience is that depression, anxiety, whatever it is you might be going through, remember, no condition in this human life is permanent. It may be a difficult moment in your life right now, but it is transient, and that will pass. We don't know what it would look like, but what we do know is that this will not stay forever. So bear that in mind. But hopelessness, helplessness is one of the things that people would experience. Others would feel worthless. Others would experience excessive levels of guilt. As I said earlier, even when they haven't done anything, they will still assume guilt, and then assume blame. And then it's usually, I've done this for this person, but I could have done more. And why didn't I do more? And they keep on berating themselves, being extremely hard on themselves, for what life might hold for them at the time. For some people, it's a case of difficulty having clear thinking process, or even making the simplest of decisions about life seems like a mountain to climb. And then, of course, for others, they will go through the thoughts of needing to end it all because they just can't see any way out. For others, this would affect, remember I talked about the impact of low levels of serotonin and the fact that it affects sexual desire and function. For others, when they're going through this, especially for the couples, the last thing you want to think about is to engage in sexual intimacy. And let me say, for couples out there, if your partner, your husband or your wife may be struggling sometimes, please be patient with them when they can't and may not be ready to engage with you sexually. It's part of, or it may be part of the problem they're going through at the time. I know cases where, as a husband, some people will say, or maybe as a wife, some people will say, I'm on heat. And if I'm on heat and I have the need, you just have to be there and provide. There are times that simply may not be possible. Let us be patient, work alongside the partner, encourage, do the best you can to help them to get through this period, and hopefully things can then revert back to how they're supposed to be. And then, of course, I mentioned the significant change in terms of moods in cases of bipolar. All right, so let me just very quickly touch on bipolar. So with regards to symptoms, you would get a shift in mood, either the extreme highs or the extreme lows. The changes in mood for some people can be very, very rapid. And usually bipolar, when they're going through the low end of the pole, the low end in terms of mood, usually there can be a high rate of suicide associated with that. In some cases, some people may need hospitalization when they're going through a severe form of bipolar. Usually, when they're going through the manic phase, on the other hand, you find that these people would have an extremely high sense of self-importance and self-esteem and some elements of grandeur around them. They are on top of the world. Some people will say that when they actually, I remember there was a young lady who was a PhD student, and she would say when she was going through the manic phase, that was the time she would be able to get a lot of work done in a very short space of time. During the manic phase, some people can talk like talkative. You just can't stop them. Their thoughts are usually racing 1,000,000 miles per hour, and they can be very easily distracted. And what you also find is that during that phase, they can engage in some really risky behaviors without necessarily taking time to think or to process what it is that they are actually going through. So things like overspending, careless sexual activity, unwise business investments. A case in point, a lady I worked with, she was struggling with bipolar, and usually during the manic phase, she had 3 different sexual partners. She was a married woman, and she would go around and sleep with all these men. But then after she'd done that, and there is a switch in moods, then there is extreme level of guilt that would engulf this woman, her mood, everything would drop so significantly that the whole area of suicide then becomes so real, because she feels so guilty about what she's done that she feels the only way out is to end it all. So again, if you know somebody that there are possibilities that this may be a problem, it may be something you need to look out for that individual. If they go through this manic phase and you see a significant change in their behavior, especially taking very risky and engaging in very careless activities. So also, just very briefly, let me touch on the postnatal depression. We told that as many as 80% of mothers would normally experience what we call the baby blues. So after the mother has a child, they will normally experience things like mood swings, fatigue, sadness, but usually this should last around 2 weeks. If it goes beyond the 2 weeks and 4 weeks on, they are still experiencing these sort of symptoms, then you may be looking at somebody going through postnatal depression. For some mothers, this could turn into a major depressive disorder. So significant depressed mood, low self-worth, failure as a mother. And there are so many mothers out there, new mothers especially, who sometimes really struggle with even the simplest of things like being able to breastfeed your child. As you know, as a society, and of course, it's always a thing that you expect having a child to be an amazing experience for any mother or for any parents, to be able to bring this new life into the world. And so there is usually so much expectation that goes with that. But the reality for many mothers is that this can be very, very different. My line of work is kind of giving me the chance to get to learn a little bit more about some of the traumas that our mothers sometimes go through in childbirth, sometimes even to a point that, of course, their very own lives may be at stake. And if they do happen, if they are blessed enough to get through the experience of safe delivery, there is also the challenge of whether or not all the expectations that comes with being a new mother, being able to breastfeed, being able to bond with your child, that all these things we expect to happen naturally. The reality of many mothers are that these are very, very different. And when that happens, some mothers then again assume the blame. It's me, I'm the mother, I'm the one that carried the baby, I'm the one that is supposed to be able to do even the basic things like feeding the baby, and I can't even do that. And for a mother, they will see that as a failure, which can impact, therefore, their mood and increase or exacerbate the problem of PND or postnatal depression that they would go through. Intensity of this usually will vary from person to person. And so we're told that for some mothers, in terms of figures, this is kind of from the US, 10 to 15 of women, would experience some postnatal depression. They talk about 1 in 5 mothers usually will go on to experience major depression. And then there's the interesting part for the fathers. 10% of new fathers may experience postnatal depression. As I said, for the fathers, usually this is very much a case of adjustment. Perhaps before the baby came along, especially if they are new parents, it was just mother and husband. Even during the pregnancy, you're all so close and you're all looking forward to this baby coming, and the baby comes, and then it appears that all the attention is now on the baby, and the father sometimes feels very much left out. And sometimes this adjusting to this new condition for some fathers is a real challenge to be able to do. So, with all that I've said, who can be affected by depression? As a common mental health disorder, as we said last time, anyone can experience this. Ministers, as in gospel ministers, do go through it. Ministers' wives, sometimes some of my colleagues have had a chance of doing some work with some of our ministers' wives. They go through their own challenges. Pop stars, you can see on there this guy who used to manage the Welsh football team, who went on, we understand, took his own life. This was somebody who was doing so well in life. But what happened? Politicians, statesmen, musicians, it really doesn't matter who you are or where you might be in your life, whether you're rich, whether you're poor. Anyone, given life circumstances, could find yourself struggling with depression. And so when depression hits, or if a person goes through this, what are some of the impact that this could have on them? Individuals may struggle with depression, and in terms of their lack of ability to function from day to day. There are some people, it would affect the way to work, it would affect their ability to socialize. Some people will rather, and of course, when it comes to depression, your duvet and your bed is the most attractive place you want to be. And people will rather spend time in the duvet or under the duvet rather than getting out. So there is an impact there. Children in the family, sometimes they can become carers all too soon. I had a young lady I worked with years back. She was at the time 21, but actually she had become a carer for her mother, single parent, a single mother who was struggling with quite major depression for a while, even to a point that the girl at some point was skipping school. And we'll come up with stories, but actually what she was doing, she was so afraid to leave her mother on her own. And so she would spend time at home looking after her mother, which meant her education suffered and potentially her future could also suffer. And then there is a partners in relationships as well. Sometimes the frustration that comes with the fact that your partner is struggling, you don't really know what you can do to help the partner, rendering the other person very helpless in the process. There are economical impacts that this could bring. There are higher rates of drug abuse and alcohol abuse. There are job disability and school problems for young people, suicide ideation, worsening of medical conditions for some people. Just wrapping up, in terms of treatment, what can a person get if you're going through depression? So there is psychotherapy, medication. The combination we're told offers the best form of treatment. And then there is cognitive behavior therapy out there. There is antidepressants, which can help a person to get their functioning going. I mentioned St. John's wort, the natural alternative, but also lifestyle management is very important. Exercises, making sure you're getting proper sleep, making sure proper diet. Again, as a church, we're blessed with a health message, and there is so much we can do in this area to be able to improve not just our physical health, but our mental health. And then there are self-help materials out there you can get online also, which can be very useful. And if you're living with someone, actually, maybe we can pick this up next week, Pastor, if that's okay. Just this last 2 slides on depression, and then we can join that with suicidal or suicide prevention next week, if that's okay. Just because of the time, maybe we can allow some 5 minutes for questions or comments, and then we'll wrap up for today and pick up on those last 2 slides and join that with suicide prevention, if that's okay.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you very much. So anyone with any question or comments, please, let's do that briefly and wrap up for tonight and pick up from next week.
Yes, I'd like to.
Thank you.
How could the health message would help in this depressive illnesses? So what could a church do through the health message nowadays, where there are so many brothers, sisters, families, singles, elderly, youngers might go through, as you listed, for the different reasons? So how could the health message help?
Okay, thank you. That's a wonderful question. Thank you for raising that. So I believe that the health message that we have as a church, in as much as sometimes it feels there is a lot of emphasis on the physical side of our health, actually a lot of the things that we talk about, like sleep, sunshine, physical exercises, I'm thinking of the old acronym New Start that we used to have. All these things would normally help to put a person in a very good position physically, which sometimes would also impact their mental health. We know research has confirmed, and there are a lot of organizations that do this. And actually, when it comes to treating depression, one of the key areas that normally we would be looking at is what we call behavioral activation. We look at how we help a person to become more active and to do all the things that usually naturally can actually help to boost serotonin levels, in the brain. So these are some of the things that as a church we can reinforce. We can re-emphasize the importance of the health message, for example, New Start, because of the elements that it highlights. That may be one aspect. The other aspect that we can also do to help with our emotional mental health is that sometimes within our congregations, we know there are people that may be very alone, very lonely, for whatever reason. And we can foster a place, we can create forums or place where at least these individuals will be able to go, feel comfortable, be able to connect. We can set up kind of support groups within our churches where it would allow people to be able to share and talk and know that they are not the only ones going through what they might be going through. People sometimes would experience bereavement. And sometimes what we might be very good at doing is that when these events happen, so people experience loss, when these events happen, as a church, sometimes we are fantastic during the initial stages. There will be visits, there will be, phone calls, there will be encouragements, there will be Bible texts. We do all this. We flood these individuals with support initially. But as time goes on, it's almost like after all that initial support, everything just disappears. And all of a sudden, this person is just left then to face everything that they have to go through. I think we need a sustained approach where we look at ways of supporting individuals, and where we talk about loneliness or isolation being a risk factor or a maintenance factor, we can help in a practical way to cut down some of this loneliness, some of this isolation that people go through, and we can look at a whole approach to maybe helping to prevent people from slipping into mental health issues to start with. But then when it happens, we can still play a role in terms of how we practically support the individual. If they need professional help, we can be there as a church to support in how that can be done. And there is a role that we can still play to help someone to overcome that. And that is actually part of also the slides that we'll talk about next week. For example, if you live with someone who is going through it, what can you do to help that individual? So we'll cover some of those factors a bit more next week as well. But in terms of our health message, there is a lot we have that even if we're doing from a physical standpoint, it can have a positive impact on our mental health.
Thank you. Both of them sounds very nice theories. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Anyone else? Maybe one more. Okay. If there isn't any...
Sorry, okay. Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Have
please.
you treated, I know that women going through the menopause is not some things that's discussed.
Yeah.
I think women are embarrassed to talk about it. And I think, so have you treated women for depression going through the menopause? Is it talked about? Is it discussed to put women at ease and their husbands, to educate their husband what the women are going through?
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Kay. Again, thank you for a very, very good question. So there are elements to your question. First and foremost, have I treated anyone going through depression and going through menopause? The answer is yes. I have worked with women going through that. It happens. People seek support for that. But I completely get your point. that there are those who would feel ashamed somehow to talk about, menopause. This is part of our natural human cycle, and women do go through this. And when there are these hormonal changes, it can affect them significantly, just like a woman might have had a baby and there are hormonal changes that also affects them. So it is a real problem. Women struggle with it. And yes, I have treated some women with depression who are going through that. Let me also just say, though, that actually in this day and age, whereas maybe we in the past will be looking at women in perhaps middle age, maybe in their 50s, might be the time where they would experience menopause. I think increasingly, at least I've come across a few women much younger who may be talking about going through early menopause. So these are real situations. I think that for some people, sometimes you consult a medical doctor, and I'm not sure, or I think, if I can recall, sometimes there are medication that can help with some of those hormonal changes that they go through. But it is real. For a gentleman who might be going through, remember, whatever the cause, whether it's menopause or whether it is some other precipitating factor, please be patient, walk alongside, support, encourage the other person to get through to the other side, so you can re-enjoy your relationship in the way that you hope to. I think the point about your question about education, this is probably very important, but I think this is probably something that may require a topic on its own to really talk about this, and maybe share experiences for people to know that there are a lot of women who go through this. In fact, most women will go through this, and it would help educate us men as well, so that if we find our women going through that, our way of dealing with it, might be one of support rather than one that creates tension or problem for the family. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I think we will probably end here. God willing, next week we will touch on how do you support someone who is going through it. And then we'll also look at suicide prevention. We'll look at the risk factors. We'll look at, again, some of the cues, the things that we need to look out for, with the people around us, because you never know. You could be sitting in church with somebody next to you, and you never know what that person might be leaving church and maybe thinking about going to do when they're going through a problem such as depression. Before I hand over back to Pastor, I would ask if it's okay to bow your head and we'll pray together to close. Father, I just want to thank you so much for this time we've had to talk about a subject that perhaps we don't spend a lot of time to talk about, to reflect upon, yet knowing that it is prevalent, that a lot of people go through it, maybe because of shame, maybe because of stigma. But whatever it is and whatever the situation might be, Lord, I just want to thank you for this privilege to be able to openly talk and discuss about it. I don't know what anybody on this platform might be going through, but it's very possible that there may be one person, or maybe two people, or maybe three people experiencing and struggling with their own problem of depression, even to a point that they probably are beginning or maybe even lost all hope. I pray, Father, that you would come very close to that individual, if there is such a person here, that through their sense of hopelessness, that you would inspire a new sense of hope in them. That if they feel extremely tired with it all and feel weak, I pray, Lord, that in you, that they would find strength. And above all, I pray, Father, that the hope and joy and peace that you only can provide would be their experience, and that the problem that they might begin to feel or might have felt is here to last forever, you would help them to see that there can be a better tomorrow. I pray, Lord, that we would experience your blessings in a special way, even as you stay close to us. For we ask all these in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.